Characteristics of and organization of muscles. The major four characteristics of muscle is that they are excitable, pick a different color for that, excitable, contractile, extensible, and elastic. Excitable refers to it's capable of being electrically induced. Neurons are going to fire. It's going to be received by a muscle cell, that sort of that electrochemical signal, and it's going to be stimulated to contract. So in another way, you can say it's stimulatable. Okay. They are contractile. All muscles contract, which means shorten themselves. All muscles are capable of making themselves shorter, like in this picture, contractility. You have a muscle at rest. When it's stimulated, when the muscle cells are excited, they will shorten. Mechanisms are put in place in a muscle that shorten them. Muscles are not capable of lengthening themselves, except for your tongue. Remember the rule overall. Your tongue's really the exception, but we're not going to concern ourselves with the exception while we're still getting the basics, right? Muscles are not capable of lengthening themselves. They are capable of being stretched by other muscles. So whenever you're stretching your muscles, what you're doing is you're using one side of your body and contracting it while the other side gets extended, it gets pulled. So think about, maybe do with me a side bend. I'm going to do this while I'm lecturing, even though you can't see me. I'm going to put my right hand straight up into the air, and I'm going to lean to the left as hard as I can until I feel the right side of my abdominothoracic cavity stretching, right? I can feel all that nice side stretch. My lats, my obliques, my serratus are all stretching. But the action that I'm undergoing is not stretching them. I'm not telling my obliques or lats or whatever, please stretch, please lengthen. What I'm doing is I'm contracting those muscles on my left side to pull, to make this right side of my body longer so that those muscles get stretched out. When you're stretching and you're doing stretching exercises like yoga and you're talking about all these lengthening moves, that's really what you're doing, is you're just contracting part of your body to lengthen the other. And it feels really good, right? And finally, muscles are elastic. It would be no good if muscles could contract and they were stretchy and extensible, but they couldn't bounce back to shape, right? You would quickly turn into some lumpy, bumpy, Gumby type figure. So they also bounce back into their original size and shape after any given contractile event. They can become stronger, thicker with time and with effort. They're not necessarily going to become inherently longer without other kinds of skeletal growth. Functions of muscle include, obviously, you're familiar with this, producing movement. You're taking your skeleton, the things that are attached to your skeleton are going to pull on your skeleton. Your skeletal muscles will pull at your skeleton and move you around the world. They're going to help you grip a pencil, take any given step, jump up and down, sit down, stand up. So all locomotion and movement is directed by skeletal muscles and fueled by the activity of cardiac muscles, right? Those are pumping blood around your body. Your skeletal muscles can't do anything without blood. So indirect cardiac. Movement of blood by the heart is done exclusively by cardiac muscles, facilitated by smooth muscles, right? Because smooth muscles line the blood vessels. As blood vessels expand or contract, they might allow more or less blood through them. And the pressure differences can influence the rate of the heart. So movement of blood by the heart is by cardiac muscle. Locomotion in your bodily movements throughout the world is run by skeletal muscle. And the movement of food through, I'm just going to take this and any body tubes. Movement of food through the GI tract or anything through the tubes of your body. Your blood vessels are big open tubes that blood travels through. Those are lined with smooth muscle. Your ureters, your bladder is a big sac, body tubes and sacs. Your urinary bladder is a big sac that's lined with smooth muscle. Your urethra is smooth muscle. Your gallbladder is made up of smooth muscle. Your stomach, your esophagus, your colon, these are all smooth muscle. Well, the first part of your esophagus is skeletal, but the rest of it is smooth muscle. These smooth muscles will contract in a regular repeating motion called peristalsis. This is a term unique to smooth muscle. And it's a series of contracting long ways and contracting short ways. So when you have food that's moving through this tube, you have a food ball, a bolus, that used to be here. Or sorry, that used to be basically here. And then around through the circular layer that goes around the muscle in this sort of orientation, it squeezes and pushes on the bolus. Now, theoretically, that bolus, when you contract right up against it, could move forward down the length of the tube or backwards, right? If it's just pinching in the middle of this bolus, it could go either way. So your smooth muscle does another thing where it shortens. So it'll pinch off, and at the same time, the walls of the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle, the long ways layer that are all oriented like this, will shorten and contract up towards that contraction. When it does that, it makes it so that the path of least resistance is down the length of the tube in the direction you want. This motion is exactly the same as what worms use to move. So if you really want to get a good, clear mental image of what your GI tract is doing when it pushes food along the length, go find yourself a worm. You'll see you can pick a point on the worm that doesn't seem to move. That part will squeeze a little bit. Everything behind that worm will shorten up towards the squeezed point, and then the rest of it can come forward. So if you pictured something that's stationary underneath the worm, it's going to move closer and closer to the tail as the worm goes through this contractile, shortening, contraction, shortening kind of a motion. Muscles of all kinds except for cardiac are constantly twitching. Your smooth muscle cells have some small low-level twitching going on even when they're not being used. Your skeletal muscles do a lot of this constant low-level twitching when they're not being used to maintain their own muscle tone. Muscles that aren't moving don't get maintained as well. So in order to make sure that they're able to preserve their mass and their functionality, they have to kind of, get up and twitch every now and again. This also keeps you, as I mentioned before, oriented perpendicularly to gravity. As you're sitting in the chair, your back muscles, your abdominal muscles, your shoulder muscles, your neck muscles are all holding your upper body upright against gravity. You don't just collapse into a heap on the floor at all times, right? So you're not really contracting any of those muscles, but you are kind of experiencing this constant low-level twitching in all of them. that keeps that keeps your body in sort of a slightly contracted state to keep you up. Muscles help stabilize joints. We've talked about this in lab a little bit by now. So you'll have, let's take the rotator cuff, right? You have, and this is going to be a terrible drawing, I apologize now. You have your scapula. You have your humerus. There's the head of the humerus. Here's your surgical neck, right? This is a shallow joint. So in order to keep the humerus stable inside of the glenohumeral joint, you have muscles that come and wrap themselves around and hug the humerus into the joint, the ball into the socket of that joint. Same thing with your femur, right? That doesn't have as much mobility in the acetabulum, but it has a lot of strength. It has a lot of muscles that are hugging it into a nice deep socket. That's keeping things stable. Your muscles, in particular your skeletal muscles, also help generate heat. Your heart burns more energy, or your heart burns energy constantly, but it's a small organ, relatively speaking. So it generates heat, but not so much. Your skeletal muscles, a lot of your body mass. And remember, it's constantly doing this low-level twitching, even when you're lying flat in bed and asleep, just to maintain its own mass. While it's twitching, it has to be getting energy from somewhere to do that twitching. Therefore, it's burning ATP. And the major waste product, you can say, or a major waste product of burning ATP is heat, right? So you're constantly generating heat by just the basic maintenance twitching of your muscle cells. If you lost a lot of muscle mass over your whole body, let's say you were in a full body cast for 6 months, you would find that you're a little colder than before, assuming your fat level is the same. That's one reason among many, many, many reasons why older people find themselves to get cold a lot more easily than they used to. People with a lot of muscle mass don't necessarily get cold as easily as somebody with very little muscle mass. If you are cold, if whatever your muscle mass is, if you go outside and it's 10 degrees out, what's going to happen soon? You're going to start to shiver, right? Your body is going to say, oh shoot, this is super cold. We can't afford this. We got to start generating heat now so we don't die. And the most efficient way to do that is to get your muscles contracting en masse over and over and over quickly. That's going to burn through a bunch of energy. And when you burn through a bunch of ATP energy, you're going to release a lot of heat, and it'll help you keep warm. Each muscle is considered a discrete organ. Each muscle operates separately from other muscles technically. Now, many of them are arranged in groups. You're rarely going to just contract one muscle. That signal will get sent to multiple muscles, but each muscle is its own separate thing. Muscles are made up of several kinds of tissues. You have muscle fibers, which is the proper word for muscle cells. So from now on, we're going to refer to muscle cells as muscle fibers. You've got blood vessels. You've got one artery per muscle, one major artery per muscle, plus at least one vein that's draining blood away from the muscle. These are often the larger named arteries and veins that can go to each one. This is made up of connective tissue, epithelium, smooth muscle. You also have nerves. You have at least one main one that serves any given muscle. And then that nerve, just as well as the blood vessels, will branch substantially within the muscle to make sure that every muscle fiber is capable of getting a little bit of an electric zap. Nerves carry electrical signals. So it makes sure that every given muscle cell can get some of that zap from the nerve, and therefore every muscle is communicating sufficiently with the nervous system that it can be stimulated, it can be excited to contract. And you've got lots of connective tissue in any given muscle. You have epimysium, outside of muscle, of the whole muscle. Perimysium surrounds a fascicle. Talk about that in a second. And endomysium surrounds the sarcolemma and fiber, muscle fiber. You also have tendons, a tendon sheath, and a special arrangement of tendony tissue called an aponeurosis. Now, all of this, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, and tendons are made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember, for the purposes of an exam, you need to write out dense, irregular, but from now on, I'd be fine with CT for connective tissue. Dense, irregular, you do have to spell out, though. Tendon sheath is dense, regular connective tissue. Sorry. Let me fix that. I should have put those in a different order. Your tendon is dense, regular connective tissue. Your tendon sheath, endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium, those are all dense, irregular connective tissue. And we'll talk about why that is in a couple of slides. So you have this picture over here to the right. You have a whole muscle, right? Just take this top one. And you've got another muscle down here, right? And it kind of goes back like that, right? You have a connective tissue layer that surrounds the outside of this muscle. And in fact, it merges with the epimysium of the next muscle. This is your epimysium. IUM. Now you see each of these groups of muscle fibers in here, and they're separated by white lines. Those white lines are also dense irregular connective tissue, and each one of those red groupings are your fascicle. You can see one of them's pulled out here. This is a fascicle. It's a collection of muscle fibers bound up by perimysium. That's also dense irregular connective tissue. This is cut off a little bit, but here you can see is one muscle fiber. A muscle fiber's plasma membrane has its own special features, and so it has its own special name, and that special name is a sarcolemma. And that in turn is covered by the endomysium. Endomysium, perimysium, epimysium, all dense irregular connective tissue, and they all merge with each other as they grow out. So the endomysium around a single muscle fiber is super, super, super thin. All of them collectively will sort of blend into each other. So the endomysium of one motor neuron, or sorry, one muscle fiber that's next to another muscle fiber, those endomysia will sort of merge into one another and stick. All of them will then eventually, once they get to the outside, merge to become the perimysium, which is thicker than endomysium. And then all of those perimysia will merge and on the outside of the muscle become epimysium, and that's the thickest. At the end of a muscle, and I'm going to have to draw this out a little bit because it doesn't show up very well in this picture. We're going to repeat all of this a bunch of times over in these slides. This is very, very repetitive because there's a lot of new and very similar sounding terminology, so I'd rather be repetitive and boring than risk glossing over one of these terms overly much. So you have a muscle, right? Here's your muscle, and then you have your epimysium. That's a bad color here, blue. You have your epimysium surrounding the whole muscle. The end of the muscle fibers themselves, the perimysium and endomysium, are going to become, instead of being irregular, they're going to even out and run in this parallel long arrangement. The dense irregular connective tissue fibers, those collagen fibers of the endomysium and perimysium, when they get to the end of the muscle, are going to smooth out and become long and parallel to become dense, regular connective tissue. The epimysium on the outside of the muscle cell will remain dense, irregular connective tissue. Sorry, I'm making a lot of mistakes today. Now think about why that might be useful. You have, let's say, there's a person's foot, leg, there's their ankle. You have your gastrocnemius here. Okay? This is ultimately going to attach to your ankle or to your back of your heel. So you'll have a tendon that attaches to the back of your heel. And here's your epimysium, which when it starts going around the dense regular connective tissue tendon will start to be called the tendon sheath. The tendon has to be able to anchor the muscle belly to its bony attachment. When the muscle contracts, it needs to pull on the heel. Otherwise, what's the point of the muscle contracting? If you have a connection that's super rigid, if you put too much force on it or sudden force, that connection is going to break. It's going to be too brittle. So by having these wavy and therefore slightly stretchy fibers that you find in dense, regular connective tissue, you have a little bit of give before the heel will get pulled by the gastrocnemius, or by when the bony part of that attachment gets pulled on by the muscle by way of the tendon. You get a little bit of give so you can afford sudden rapid movement without breakage. You can also stretch, right? You have your tibialis anterior. I know it's drawn on the outside of the leg. I'm not an artist. I'm not gonna. Okay? If you contract the tibialis anterior, the foot's going to be pointed up. That means the gastroc, the tendon of the gastroc, your Achilles tendon, has to be able to stretch, or else it'll just break when you try to raise your foot. The epimysium, which when it surrounds the tendon is now called the tendon sheath, it has to be able to stretch too, but it doesn't just have to be in one direction. The tendon really only has to stretch well in one direction. It's really bad at stretching sideways. And if you get a sideways impact or a stretch on that tendon, it tends to break. The epimysium and the dense irregular connective tissue of the epimysium/tendon sheath has fibers that go all sort of which ways, right? This means it can stretch slightly and be strong in lots of directions. So here's your gastroc again with its tendon. When your gastroc shortens to pull up on the heel, the epimysium has to be able to stretch outwards with that muscle belly as it gets rounder without tearing. So by having a little bit of give in all directions, it can accommodate the contraction of the muscle. And when your tendon shortens or lengthens, it's also going to get a little fatter or a little skinnier, just like a muscle will if it contracts or is stretched. So the tissue type around in muscles is really important. The connective tissue, knowing what connective tissue does what is really important. Tendons are dense, regular connective tissues. The collagen is all lined up in the same direction. It's all parallel so that it can stretch nicely in one direction. Everything else has to be able to get shorter, longer, fatter, skinnier. So it needs to have collagen fibers that can go in all different directions. So dense, irregular connective tissue is what's going to surround those. The only thing I'm leaving off so far is the aponeurosis. That's just a tendon. That's really just a tendon that is long and flat instead of round. So you find an aponeurosis on the top of your head, for example. You have on your forehead your frontalis muscle or the frontal belly of your occipitofrontalis, whichever you learn, and you'll learn both depending on what class you're in and who you're talking to. But your forehead muscle is your frontalis muscle. The back of your head muscle is the occipitalis muscle. Makes sense, right? Frontal region, occipital region, frontal bone, occipital bone, your brain, the lobes of your brain, frontal lobe, occipital lobe. So when you contract your frontalis muscle, it pulls your scalp forward towards the front of your face. You don't have muscle on the top of your head. Instead, the frontal belly, the frontalis muscle, and the occipitalis muscle are connected by a long, flat tendon sheath that lays flat up against your skull. If you feel your skull, you don't find like a cord in there anywhere, right? It's all arranged nice and long. And it has the same connective tissue arrangement as a tendon, where the inside is dense, regular connective tissue, and the outside is dense, irregular connective tissue, although the ratio is quite a bit off. The middle part, that dense regular, is really minimal. The outside connective tissue part's thicker. But the main part that you want to know is the tissue arrangements of your epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, tendon, and tendon sheath, and then also know that an aponeurosis is just a big flat tendon. So let's talk about this one more time, and we're just going to focus on the contractile stuff this time. We're not going to worry so much about the connective tissue stuff. The muscle itself is made up of myofilaments, which arrange into a sarcomere. Sarcomeres are arranged into myofibrils. A collection of myofibrils fills a muscle fiber, which, as you recall, is the correct word for a muscle cell. A group of muscle fibers bound with connective tissue is a fascicle, and a group of fascicles connected by connective tissue is a whole muscle. So this, I'm sorry, this got cut off too. There we go, just to extend that. Inside of a muscle fiber, you have myofilaments. Those are individual protein strings. Made of either actin primarily or myosin primarily. These are the things that are going to slide past each other to cause muscles to contract. They all have these little sort of dongles on the outside of them that will interact and pull them closer in towards a midline, or overlap them more so that one of them goes towards a midline. And so those, you have those strings. And remember from the skeletal muscle discussion that they overlap, and the overlapping part is the striations. I'm not sure if I remember to mention this. Smooth muscle is not striated. Smooth muscle does not have this regular repeating pattern where things overlap in nice stripes. It's a little more crisscrossy instead of straight across. So skeletal and cardiac muscle are striated, smooth is not. But each one of these protein strings is a myofilament. And then the pattern is just going to keep going, right? So you have those and then more fibers. and those, more fibers, and then more fibers. And they're just going to keep going in that pattern. One iteration of that pattern, so you can break it off there, you can make a new one here, you can draw a new one here. See how they repeat and they mirror each other? Each one of those is considered to be a discrete contractile unit, the most basic contractile unit of the cell, which is a sarcomere. Bundles of these lined up end-to-end sarcomeres are called myofibrils. Okay, so these are already organized. You have these strings, these protein strands, strings of myofilaments that overlap over each other, and then like one section of that overlap is a sarcomere. And then lots of those sarcomeres end to end creates its own long string, this tube sort of, called a myofibril. A bunch of myofibrils arranged in a bundle fills the muscle fiber, aka the muscle cell. Now I'd like to take just a quick second and point out, whoops, let me get my pen back. Muscle fiber refers to skeletal muscle, which as we discuss muscles throughout this unit, we're basically always talking about skeletal muscles unless mentioned otherwise. It's got a very simple, straightforward pattern that you can follow, you can learn the mechanics of, and then you can learn the exceptions to that with cardiac and smooth muscle more easily. So we start with skeletal muscle and we assume skeletal muscle unless otherwise said. If we're talking about muscle cells in cardiac or smooth muscle tissue, those are really called myocytes. Okay? But at any rate, we're talking about skeletal muscle by default. So a muscle fiber is also known as a muscle cell, which is a bundle of muscle myofibrils, which is longwise divided into a bunch of sarcomeres, and each sarcomere is made up of myofilaments. A fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. They're all bound up like cordwood or like matches in a matchbook with its own surrounding connective tissue. And then a bunch of the fascicles make up the whole muscle. So it's sort of like you have strings gathered up into, or like strands gathered up into a single like strand of yarn, or a rope, for example. You bundle up a bunch of ropes together, bundle up more ropes, bundle up more ropes, and now you have this bigger collection of very, 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 very strong strands. Together they're very strong, individually they're quite weak. All right, going back to the connective tissue sheaths, you have epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So you have your muscle fiber, your muscle cell. That, if you recall, is made up of a bunch of myofibrils. Those are divided down into sarcomeres longwise, and each one of those sarcomeres is made up of a bunch of myofilaments. But the muscle fiber itself has its own special name for the plasma membrane called the sarcolemma, that in turn is surrounded by endomysium, a very thin, wispy connective tissue. A bunch of muscle fibers with their endomysia bound up into a bundle makes a fascicle. All of this I'm going to pick a different color than red. Sorry, I keep doing that. In between here, each one is going to be surrounded by that connective tissue, but there's not really a beginning and an end to it when they're bound up together next to each other like this. All that is going to really just merge into one another. And then they're all going to merge on the outside into a thicker paramycium. These fascicles and their paramycia are going to get bound together. And again, your paramycia are going to kind of blend into one another. Right? And on the outside, they'll merge and become the epimycium. In the paramycium, this is where you're going to find things like blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and your major nerves. They will penetrate the fascicle so that it can deliver information, waste, take away waste, deliver nutrients to each individual muscle fiber, but those are going to be much smaller. Arterioles, for example, capillaries, very, very, very fine nerve fibers. The named nerves, the major nerves, are going to go down to at least the fascicle level and be embedded in the paramycium. That epimycium, that outside dense irregular connective tissue bundle, is going to be thick and robust. It'll merge with the superficial fascia under the skin, or a deep fascia, which connects one muscle to a bunch of other muscles. The epimycium covers the whole muscle, and since it connects, that epimycium merges with epimycium on other muscles, which in turn merges with what's under your skin. When you contract one muscle, you're going to be doing stuff to the surrounding structures, right? If you contract your transversalis muscle, your transversus abdominis, for example, you remember which one that is? It's the long ways muscle that kind of wraps around your abdomen like a belt. You can contract that by, let's sit up straight for just a minute, as straight as you can, and then pull your belly button in towards your spine. Not sucking in your stomach, but tensing your stomach. Now, when you did that, did just your transversus abdominis contract and everything else was left alone, or did other stuff get pulled with it? Did you feel your stomach get pulled in a little bit when you do that? Yeah. You can also feel your rectus, your up and down front of your abdomen muscle, engage a little bit. It's getting tugged on, and so it's going to start to kind of tug back a little. Your obliques are going to get pulled on a little bit because your transversus abdominis is attached, at least by the epimycium, to the internal obliques, which are also sort of attached to your external obliques by way of the epimycium, which are attached to your rectus muscle by way of the epimycium. They're all sort of merged together, and they're all that whole group is surrounded by its own special extra fascial layer that keeps them together. And that is connected to the underside of your skin. So when you contract your muscle, your skin ends up moving along with it. Get rid of that a little bit. There we go. So this, I just love this picture because it's an electron microscope image. I love electron microscopy. I just think those images are so stinking cool. The color, just to remember, or to remind you, the color that you see in these electron microscopy images is always false. Electron microscopy is necessarily black and white grayscale images. Color that you see is added there by the scientist or the artist so you can tell different tissues apart more easily. But anyway, here you can see a fascicle. In that orangey color. And what's cool is you can see, so you have capillaries that are coming in to the interior of the fascicle. Those would have come in by way of the paramycium. And you can see all this out here, how sort of disorganized and spiderwebby it looks. That is your paramycium. You have anywhere from hundreds to thousands of fascicles that make up a whole muscle. Depends on how big the muscle is. The bigger it is, the more fascicles it'll make, or it will have. So if that whole large thing is a fascicle, what is any one of those? Those are muscle fibers. Right, those are individual muscle cells. Isn't that cool? And even then you can see that there's some sort of a little bit of basic organization to how those are bundled. It's not as organized necessarily as the whole fascicle, and each one of these has its own little endomysium around it. But there's always some sort of organization when you have these groups of cells. Pretty cool, huh?